Every minimalist interior you have ever admired began with removal. Not the removal of everything. The removal of one specific category of thing, in a specific order, that changed the character of the space so completely that everything remaining looked better for its absence. The first category that minimalist designers remove is the one that requires the least psychological difficulty and produces the most immediate visual impact. Duplicates. The multiples of the same type of object that accumulate in every room over time. Not because multiples were ever needed, but because additions were made without auditing what was already there. 3 throw pillows where 1 would suffice. 4 ceramic vessels on a shelf where 2 would be more visible. 2 lamps in a room that only needs 1. 6 candles on a coffee table where 1 creates the intended atmosphere more powerfully than 6 diluted across the surface. Each duplicate was added individually, at different times, and each seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they produce a room that looks full rather than considered, where every object competes with its duplicates for attention rather than being given the space to be fully seen. The rule that minimalist designers apply to duplicates is specific. For any category of object in a room, identify the best one and remove the rest. The best throw pillow stays is a room where every remaining object looks more expensive, more considered, and more intentional than the same objects looked when they shared the space with their less distinguished siblings. The second removal is more psychologically demanding than the first because it targets objects that are not obviously wrong. Objects that are perfectly acceptable, perfectly functional, and perfectly invisible precisely because they are perfectly generic. Default objects are the things that entered the space not because they were chosen, but because they were the path of least resistance. The prints bought because walls needed something on them. The storage baskets purchased because storage was needed, and these were convenient. The rug chosen because the floor needed covering, and this was available. Each one solved a problem, and each one solved it in the most anonymous way possible. Minimalist designers remove default objects not because they are bad, but because they are neutral in the worst sense. They contribute nothing specific to the room's character. They carry no meaning, and they require the eye to process them without rewarding the processing with anything worth finding. A room without default objects contains only objects that were actively chosen, and the difference between an actively chosen room and a default assembled room is the difference between a room that has something to say and a room that is simply furnished. The third removal targets the specific category of object that does more visual damage per unit than any other in a small space. The things that ended up on horizontal surfaces not because they were supposed to be there, but because there was nowhere else for them to go. Every horizontal surface in a room that functions as de facto storage. The coffee table holding the items that did not have an assigned home. The windowsill accumulating the objects that were placed there temporarily and never moved. The shelf that was intended for display and became overflow adds visual complexity without adding visual value. The brain processes every object on every surface, regardless of whether the object was placed with intention or landed there by default, and the accumulated processing load of multiple covered surfaces is one of the primary reasons rooms feel more tiring to be in than they should. The minimalist designer's response to this is to remove everything from every horizontal surface and then replace only what was genuinely missed. What was put back because the surface was better with it than without it, not because it needed somewhere to go. The exercise consistently reveals that most covered surfaces are better cleared than they were covered, and that the few objects placed back on them are more visible and more valuable for having been chosen a second time. The fourth removal is the most psychologically difficult on this list, and the one that minimalist designers are most honest about, because it requires a distinction that most design advice avoids making. the distinction between objects that are sentimental and objects that are sentimental and working. Sentimental objects have enormous value. They carry specific memories, specific relationships, specific moments in a life that no purchased object can replicate. This value is real and should not be dismissed. But it The fifth removal is the one that most people do not identify as a removal at all, because it involves taking away a light source rather than an object, and light sources are rarely understood as potential problems rather than solutions. The specific lighting that minimalist designers remove is the overhead fitting used as the primary light source. This is not always possible. Sometimes rental agreements or fixed wiring prevent it, but when it is possible, it is the removal that most changes the character of the space. Not because overhead lighting is inherently wrong, but because overhead lighting as the sole or dominant source creates a specific quality of uniform brightness that eliminates the shadows, the depth, and the atmospheric layering that make a room feel considered rather than simply lit. The removal of overhead lighting as the primary source, replaced by 2 or 3 warm lamps at human height, does not reduce the light in the room. It redistributes it, creating pools and shadows that give the room dimension, that make the remaining objects more visible by giving them a specific relationship with the light rather than being uniformly exposed by it, and that change the room's atmosphere from functional to inhabited. The room does not get darker. It gets better. The sixth removal addresses a specific problem that accumulates gradually in most rooms over time. The competing color, the accent that was introduced for variety, the cushion in a tone that was interesting in the shop, the object in a hue that seemed to coordinate, but actually creates visual tension with everything around it. A room with 4 accent colors is a room where the eye moves from one accent to the next without ever finding a place to rest, because rest requires resolution, and 4 competing accents do not resolve into a coherent color story. They resolve into noise. The room feels busier than its furniture count suggests, more visually active than it needs to be, and slightly unresolved regardless of how well each individual accent was chosen. The minimalist designer's approach to competing color is to reduce accents to 1, the single strongest, most specific color in the room, and remove everything that is a different accent tone. The remaining accent does not look lonely. It looks decided. And a decided accent in a room of resolved neutrals is more visually powerful than 4 competing accents in the same space, because the eye has one specific place to go and arrives there with satisfaction rather than exhaustion. The seventh and final removal is the most revealing, because the objects it targets are the ones that tell the most honest story about how the room came to be the way it is. Apology pieces are the objects placed in a room to compensate for something else. The large plant positioned to distract from the corner that never worked. The mirror placed to make the room look bigger rather than because a mirror was wanted there. The artwork hung to fill the space above the sofa rather than because it creates a feeling the room needed. Each apology piece is evidence of a problem that was decorated around rather than solved. a band-aid that became a permanent fixture because the wound underneath was never properly addressed. Minimalist designers remove apology pieces not to expose the problems they were covering, but to force a genuine solution. Without the plant in the corner must be dealt with on its own terms, redesigned, repurposed, or left empty if emptiness is the most honest response to it. Without the space-making mirror, the room must be made to feel appropriate to its actual size through arrangement and material rather than through optical illusion. The removal of the apology piece is always the beginning of a better solution, because it requires the room to be honest about what it actually is. After 7 removals, the room contains less than it did, and the question that the removals were always working toward can finally be asked honestly. What does this room actually need? Not what it is supposed to have. Not what every room of its type conventionally contains. What this specific room, in this specific light, at this specific scale, needs in order to be complete. The answer is almost always less than what was there before. One anchor piece that the room organizes itself around. One light source that creates the atmosphere the room is for. One textile that adds the warmth and texture that the room's materials cannot provide alone. One natural element, a plant, a branch, a stone, that connects the interior to the living world. And perhaps one personal object that makes the room specific to the person who lives in it rather than generic to any person who might. This is not minimalism as an aesthetic goal. It is minimalism as a discovery process. The systematic removal of everything that does not need to be there, until what remains is exactly what does. And what remains, when the process is complete, is always more than enough. 7 removals. One room that finally looks like it was meant to. Remove them in that order. Then ask what the room actually needs. The answer will surprise you. Subscribe for a new interior video. And tell us in the comments, what is the first thing you would remove from your space right now if you had to choose just one?